Thanks go to Ronald L. Barrett, Robert Menschel, Robert Neely, Don and Rosemary Webb, and Robert Zoller for their thoughtful reading of the manuscript and helpful commentaries. Introduction. This book consists of 4 main parts or sections. Each is necessary, each completes the other. The history, theory, practice, and actual examples of experimental operations must each be explored, worked through, and realized before a true quintessence can be reached. The history of the ancient Hermetic tradition must be understood today in order for us to grasp, even in some small way, the place it held in the matrix of world cultures. As Hermeticism is essentially a synthetic tradition, that is, it brings together diverse elements and harmonizes them into a whole, the various elements need to be understood so that a new synthesis can be reached by each individual Hermetic in this postmodern era. War was done in ancient times can be done again. But we must understand how it was done. Theory is not dry, cognitive wool gathering. On the contrary, it is the process of vivifying internal models of thought which gives light and vitality to magical practice. Practice without a basis in sound theory usually ends in the muddle-headed mumbo-jumbo so often too typical of occultnic culture. The Greek word biopera, theoria, means contemplation, from the verb theored. A true theory must be based on thought deeper than what is normally used in everyday life. The things observed must be more profound than everyday occurrences. A truly Hermetic theory can only be developed in conjunction with praxis. Practice is the actual exercise or enacting of the theoretical base, each operation of which, if contemplated, will perhaps in some way modify the theory until some true, Hermetic understanding is gained. The postmodern papyrus of Abaris is a collection of authentic ancient operational formulas specially translated and edited for this work. The fact that each is closely based on a formula originating in ancient times is essential to grasp. By reenacting the ancient formulas, you undertake a higher form of magic than may seem to be the case with each individual operation. On one level you may be calling forth a lover of flesh and blood, but on another you are called. 25 Introduction. Ing forth the spirit of the time of the ancient papyri, you are bending time to your will, you are shifting paradigms by magic. What lies before you is a postmodern experiment in opening the mouths of the ancient Hermetic magicians. With this work their methods and symbolism are allowed to speak to the reader directly, as they spoke to the writer as the work was being put together. The gods and goddesses standing at the gateways to this kind of knowledge have long been silent. Many have tried to make them speak in the past century and a half. But the God of the old papyri does not demand worship, but rather study and work. If this work is filled with an exacting combination of passion and precision, the methods of the Hermetic magicians can again yield a harvest of wondrous powers. This harvest cannot be enjoyed by the multitude. Results of successful work cannot be transferred easily from one magician to others. An attempt at work of this nature is witnessed by the life of Jesus the Nazarene, the Serpentine. The subsequent and immediate betrayal of the work of that Magos by his would-be followers is a testimony to the impossibility of the results of work by one magician being transferred to others. Methods of initiation, of paeia, and even salvation can be taught, but all true magicians must ultimately find the secret, the mystery of their own existences, from within. The contents of this book, this new papyrus, describe many examples and clues to the unlocking of certain secrets hidden within the souls of 72 men and women who will read its pages. Many more will read the pages, of course, but only those 72 will truly understand the mystery contained in them. Within the idea of mystery there is the possibility of ultimate understanding. On every leaf of this book there is a mystery. Readers must look beyond appearances to the hidden, unmanifest reality from which the appearances come, and which the appearances in turn conceal from the eye of the seeker. This, at least in part, is how the power of the Mysterion, or as the Egyptians would have said it, the Shtat, works in the mind of magicians to give direction and impetus to their initiations. The papyrus which lies before you is an exercise in this principle or arche of existence, and comes from the AIDN of the original mystery. Introduction. Oi. How to use this book. This is not a typical manual of contemporary magical practice. Its purpose is not to indoctrinate the reader in a certain set form of cosmology and theology, although the generation of these things is essential to development of the individual magician. Rather, this book is intended as a guide for the creation of a new and original synthesis by the individual magician based on the same constituent parts that would have faced developing Hermetic magicians around 2,000 years ago. The very process put forward by the book is an alchemical one. Elements are analyzed and recombined into a unique new synthesis, solvet coagula. Early readers of the unpublished manuscript of this book were sometimes baffled by its structure. This was perhaps because its approach is so novel, or perhaps because they had not been exposed to the necessary preliminary discourse which one hope this preface will provide. The book is divided into 4 parts: history, theory, practice, and operation in the form of the text of the magical papyrus of Abaris. In fact, there are within these 4 divisions 3 phenomena which can and should take place in someone who studies the contents of the book. The first phase is that of theoria, bicopera, which encompasses the first 2 parts of the book. Theory is thinking. The reader is challenged to work through the contents of the first 2 parts of the book carefully and thoughtfully. Success in the first phase is the beginning of the second, praxis, enpacking. Practice comes from actual enactment of the objective data the reader has absorbed into his or her subjective universe. Practice is work. From work comes the actual experience of theory, which leads to real understanding. The operations which make up the last part of the text are the result of the author's active explorations of both theoria and praxis. This experience, if profound, will lead inevitably to the emergence of a teaching, A, D, and C. The teaching of the author is embedded in the whole of the book, but is especially to be found in this preface, in the synthetic epistles of Abaris, and in the editions of the operations themselves. The implicit exhortation is for the one-time student to evolve his or her own teaching, then and only then will the final stage of real progress be possible. BL Introduction. The old Hermetic books make reference to the culmination of this process when the teacher charges the student to take what has been taught and carve for yourself in hieroglyphics in turquoise in the temple at Memphis. Too much has been made in recent years of the idea that magic is for the millions, that it is easy to understand and therefore easy to practice. In fact, magia, as described in this book, is the most challenging of human endeavors. Magia is the development of the self to a virtually divine level. It is ludicrous to undertake such a process lightly or to assume this aim is easily attained. To do so is to make the difficult impossible. Magical knowledge is mysterious knowledge. Books which purport to clarify magic to you in the same way that Greek grammar or geometry might be explained or taught are doing you a disservice. Magical knowledge, orgiensis, must come through a combination of theory and experience in such a way that the nessus comes as a genuine, unique and original discovery on your part of something which had been up to that moment hidden and outside your conscious mind. This is why real mysteries cannot be revealed in profane words but only through extended metaphors and whole methodological discourses. The word, or ayag, which guides this work is mysterion, or mystery, also sometimes referred to as krypton, that which is hidden. The Egyptians called it sht, and the Hebrews referred to such things as razum. The trick is to focus on actual mysteries and to avoid concentration on pseudo-mysteries. False mysteries are things that are secret simply because someone decides not to inform you about them. Real mysteries are those things which can only be revealed, or discovered, mysteriously. To illustrate this last point, compare atomic secrets, which are just technical formulas on how to split the atom, with secrets of the atom, which are tantamount to cosmological mysteries which can only be grasped in moments of extreme intellectual lucidity informed by the theories of physics. The first example is secret because of circumstances in the outer or objective universe, national security, and whatnot, while the second example remains secret because of realities of the inner world of the mind, or the absolute subjective universe. Introduction Exvid. In the original Greek of the magical papyri themselves, the words magic, paera, and mystery, llgtnplov, are often used synonymously. Magia is the technical practice, while mysterium is the theory or overall inner framework of the technology. Paradoxically, this seemingly obfuscating or obscurant concept of the mystery actually leads the Hermetic magician toward clarity and precision. This is why it is so essential to magical theory. The practice of seeking the mysteries fills the magician with power, dynamis, and the understanding of the mysteries creates conditions for self-transformation. This latter is the case because, in the unknown space of the mysterious, the self of the magician finds space to grow. The method of the use of mystery must involve a high degree of intellectual precision combined with an equally high degree of enthusiasm or passion for what is being done. Real mysteries must be explored and penetrated both objectively and subjectively. The best scientific knowledge, GK, episteme or dianoia, must be combined with inspired leaps of faith to result in sublime GND cis. The use of mysterious symbols and aesthetically inspirational models can have wondrous effects and provide tremendous energy to the process of transformation. But if there is no rational and objective basis, the ultimate results are likely to be inauthentic and vacuous. In an absolute sense, the method of this book is based on the 8th precept of the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It says, "Use your mind to its full extent and rise from earth to heaven, and then descend to earth and combine the powers of what is above with what is below. Thus you will win glory in the whole world, and obscurity will leave you at once." This means that the alchemist is to oscillate between the subjective EOIW spiritual realms, those above, wherein dwell the sublime forms of theory and the mind, and the objective material realms, those below, wherein the forms and theories can be tested and perfected as nowhere else in the cosmos. This bipolar path leads to the greatest states of accomplishment, the highest levels of power, and the clear XXVL introduction. S levels of understanding. In a pragmatic sense, this process is reflected in my method: objective analysis, subjective synthesis, enactment. Objective analysis of the data prepares the mind for its ascent to the upper realms where the subjective, inner, synthesis takes place. The process is not complete, however, until the subject returns from the inner, or upper, realm to test his or her transformations on the world through enactment of the vision. Essential to full and authentic use of this book and the method it espouses is a thorough study of the Corpus Hermeticum and other genuinely Hermetic texts of antiquity. This also includes the Greek magical papyri, of course. These are the primary objects of the objective analysis phase of the method. This book is an example of what can be done, but each individual must undertake his or her own journey to gain the full benefit of the method. Primary focus must be on the oldest available material, which mostly comes from the first 5 centuries of the Common Era. According to the theory behind this book, pragmatic works of Hermetic magic were often preludes to further more spiritual, or subjective, work with the same theories. But with a background in the practical and objective effects of magic, the emergent Hermetic master would have a more complete grasp of the principles at work than someone who dealt with the theories only subjectively. When and if you find yourself mystified by the contents of this book, I invite you to return to this preface and consider its words again. All knowledge and all power begin with a sense of mystery. Zien ter Muordernpua. Part 1. A History of Hermetic Magic. Ill. Origins. The kind of magic and philosophy we now call Hermetic is most clearly seen in documents dating from the first 4 or 5 centuries CE. The epicenter of Hermetic ideas was Alexandria in the Nile Delta. This is where the ancient Greek, or Hellenic culture, and that of Egypt were most completely and powerfully brought together. A secondary site of this activity was in the Fayum. These are the places where the two cultures most easily mixed, in both ethos and ethnos. Our most important source for the study of operative Hermetic magic is the body of text known as the Greek magical papyri. These will be discussed in more detail below. For now, it is important to clarify that this body of writings is not entirely Hermetic in the strict philosophical, or even theological, definition of the term. Our thesis is that the Hermetic path was one of gradual intellectualization or spiritualization of initiation. As the Hermetic initiates came closer to their goal, the techniques became progressively more focused on purely Hermetic imagery and language, but in the earlier stages of the work, it was more eclectic in its tastes and more practical in its methods. The complex Hermetic tradition has a dual heritage. This is clear when we look into the origin of the name, Hermetic. The school is named after the Greek god Hermes G.K. Epum, who is widely thought to be at least in part a Greek reinterpretation of the Egyptian god Thoth. The actual Egyptian form of his name is Gdhwty, Juti. This, the chief Hermetic god, was known in the tradition as Hermes Trismegistos, the thrice greatest. In truth, he is an amalgamation of the magician's god of the Greeks and Egyptians, but also contains the seeds of all the other gods of magic, from the Hebrews, Babylonians, and Persians as well. If we look to the very deepest roots, we can uncover the dual heritage of the Hermetic tradition. One of these roots underlies the Greek or Hellenic culture, the Indo-European. The other is that of the Semito-Hamitic or Egyptian culture. In the Hermetic magical system, these two distinct, and usually distant, cultures have been for a history of Hermetic magic, brought together in a pagan context. This original synthesis then becomes the model for any and all future amalgamations of magical traditions under the code name, Hermetic. Ultimately, all of these texts are Hermetic in the sense that they are examples of operative magic, and Thoth Hermes is the god of magic par excellence. His patronage would have been understood as being essential to the whole process in the time and place the papyri were produced. The Hellenic root. We conveniently call Indo-European the descendants of that great mass of folk speaking a related dialect and worshipping a certain pantheon of related gods and goddesses. The original homeland of these people was somewhere in the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas over 6,000 years ago. One branch of this culture made its way into the southern part of the Balkan Peninsula, present-day Greece, as early as 1900 BCE. Other independent groups of these folk later formed the Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and Iralic peoples. The most notable of the Iralics were the Romans. These Indo-Europeans also spread at an early date into Central and Southern Asia, where they called themselves Iranian Aryans. The ancient Indo-Europeans had a threefold structure of the divine. The pantheon was divided into three levels, the first of sovereign power, the second of physical power, and the third of productive or generative power. The first of these was further refined into two factors. One ruled the forces of law and order. Among the Greeks, this was originally the purview of Zeus. Later, some of Zeus' characteristics were absorbed by Apollo. The other factor was ruled by the forces of magic and mantic activities of the mind. This was, at the oldest stage, the realm of Hermes. Later, his function was absorbed by other gods and goddesses, including both Apollo and Dionysus. Hermes was the inventor of writing and the great communicator. Of course, like all peoples, the Indo-Europeans had their magical traditions. Some of these can be gleaned through comparative origins. 5. Study of the oldest levels of Celtic, Germanic, Roman, Greek, and Indo-Iranian magical practices. The Hermes of the Greeks, the Mercury of the Romans, is the god of communication, the god who is in charge of transporting the souls of the dead to realms beyond the earth, a psychopomp, the god of inspired intellect and quick wit. The magic of Hermes is rooted in the intellectual faculty of humanity, in the part of the mind which understands the forms of symbols and can put them into inspired words of poetry. Hermes has the power to synthesize the contents of the right and left sides of the brain, and to put them into communicable forms, both verbal and nonverbal, signs, symbols, gestures, music, and so on. The Hellenic spirit, exemplified in Hermes, is one which can take elements from a wide variety of sources and synthesize them into a harmonious whole. Since their early history, the Greeks had brought together elements from every exotic culture or civilization with which they had come into contact: the Aegean, Minoan, Anatolian, Persian, Hebraic, Canaanite, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian. This was made possible through the intellectual facility present in the genius of Hermes. It was the intellectual spirit of Hermes that the Greeks brought to Egypt. This spirit confronted the Egyptian gods and goddesses and the kinds of magic done in their names, and from the synthesis of the two systems, Hellenic and Egyptian, the Hermetic tradition was born. Even in the latest phases of the Hermetic tradition, the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Hermes were distinguished at a certain level. The Greek god was called Hermes Legios and was the focus of magical attention outside Egypt. Liturgically, his cult seems just as Hermetic as that of Trismegistus, the Egyptian. The Egyptian root. The importance of Egyptian magic and philosophy in the origins of the Hermetic tradition cannot be overestimated. One of the chief reasons for this is that probably most, if not all, of the Akrul authors' 6a history of Hermetic magic. Of the magical papyri were ethnic Egyptians, although they were highly Hellenized. They had learned the Greek language and wrote and spoke it fluently. They had absorbed Greek philosophy and modalities of thought. One of the chief signs of this Hellenization is the enormous eclecticism of the technical Hermetic tradition. This is totally foreign to the purely Egyptian mentality, which is intrinsically highly xenophobic. Hellenic culture began to influence Egypt strongly from about 660 BCE, when Aegus, the king of Lydia, sent mercenary troops to help secure the reign of Psammethechus I. After the war, the Greek soldiers were settled in Egypt. But the strongest Hellenistic influence is historically traced to the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. For several centuries, even millennia, preceding this date, however, there had been a long period of cultural exchange between the Greeks and Egyptians. Greek philosophers and magicians often cited Egypt as the ultimate source of their knowledge. The romantic allure of Egyptian origins has been an enduring motif in the history of Western esoterica. Egyptian thought and magical technology must be considered the basis of Hermetic, or actually, the Thean, philosophy and magic. Over this Egyptian base, Hellenistic philosophy and intellectual conceptions were laid to create a new synthesis which is the essence of the Hermetic tradition itself. The Egyptian god commonly called Thoth was the patron of magic because he was the embodiment of intelligence and the chief architect of the process of communication. These two elements are essential to the practice of magia. Even the Greeks thought of the Egyptian Hermes as the exemplary model of the magician, and thought that the books of Thoth had been translated into Greek at an archaic period of time, after the flood. In many ways, the intellectual content of Egyptian philosophy remains obscure. The conceptual world of the ancient Egyptian and the modern European are sufficiently different to make substantial understanding difficult. The Hellenizing of Egyptian thought allows easier access to the intellectual world of Egypr as it existed in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, although it had by that time become significantly westernized or Europeanized in the process. Drigens F. Egyptian magic is somewhat easier to comprehend because it conforms in most respects to the internal logic of magical operations throughout history. In the Egyptian religious tradition, magic plays a large and often official role in the cult of the gods and goddesses. The Hermetic tradition. Many scholars would like to divide the Hermetic literary tradition into two distinct types, the philosophical, exemplified in the Corpus Hermeticum, and the technical or magical, one example of which is the Greek magical papyri. The philosophical tradition, they say, is worthy of serious attention, while the magical tradition is rubbish. Attitudes such as this are merely indicative of the disease I call modernosis. One who suffers from this disease believes that magic is a primitive stage of religion, which has now given way to the new and improved way to the true form of knowledge known as science. In retrospect, we can now see that magic is as much with us today as it was in ancient times, and that in fact some ancients were often every bit as scientific in their thought as moderns. The magical tradition is merely the operative branch of the philosophy, which is more analytical or illustrative. In ancient times, the two branches worked together in individuals and their schools of thought. Each had its place in the whole scheme of human endeavor, and so it should be again today in this postmodern world. In fact, the very division between the two is an obviously modern invention. It has helped us to understand certain aspects of the tradition, but it has limited us in important ways too. Even scholars have begun to realize the limitations, and are coming to realize more and more that the operative, technical, and philosophical genres of Hermetic literature are really facets of a whole. A clarification of this problem is provided by Garth Fowden in his landmark study, The Egyptian Hermes. The operative tradition is mainly encoded in the magical papyri. These were recorded in Egypt, and there are three major types of them linguistically: Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and Coptic. The Tech. 8A History of Hermetic Magic. Nickel tradition covers what appears to be a scientific field, as this encompasses descriptions of natural phenomena in the context of the hidden sympathies which exist between and among them. The technical Hermetica include treatises on alchemy and astronomy, or astrology. The philosophical tradition is contained in a body of independent texts known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Hermetic philosophy and operative technology is a combination of every major stream of thought present in the Eastern Mediterranean region in the first few centuries after the birth of Jesus. It brings Gnosticism together with Neoplatonism and Stoicism, and places them all in an Egyptian cultural matrix. It assimilates elements from the religious and philosophical systems of the Hebrews, Mesopotamians, and Persians. The concepts contained in Greco-Roman as well as Egyptian mystery schools were encompassed, as were some formulas and ideas taken from the fledgling Christian system. In the main, however, the genius of the Hermetic system was a dynamic and non-dogmatic assimilation of the two major esoteric cosmologies of the day, Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. Hermetic magic is in essence an operationalizing of the philosophy within the technical matrix. The same cultural and philosophical elements are assimilated and synthesized in the magical papyri as in the Corpus Hermeticum. But magic is something one does, or even really which one is, not merely something one contemplates. But through a combination of action and thought, the actual essence of a person can be raised qualitatively, and with that rise in quality, true understanding can grow. A few of the ancients understood this, most modernists have forgotten it, but some postmodernists are beginning to remember. The ancient phase. Development of the much of the development of the Hermetic tradition. Metic tradition is lost in the relatively undocumented centuries before the birth of Jesus. It is clear that the tradition was being developed over Origins 9. these centuries, and that what we have in the oldest of the magical papyri is in fact a mature synthesis of the various magical and philosophical streams that had been crisscrossing the Nilotic culture for centuries. The most significant development in the final stages of the history of ancient Egypt was its conquest by the Romans in 30 BCE. With this development, Hellenic and Egyptian cultures were forced together more than they had been before during the Hellenistic period. Now both were subject peoples in the Roman Empire. In some respects, the Hermetica could be considered philosophical reactions to cultural oppression. By about 200 CE, a well-documented combination of elements had come together which became the basis for the continuing development of the Hermetic tradition. This is the basis for the texts which serve as the original foundation for the magical operations presented in this book. Early development during the period when our source texts were being recorded, there appears to have been a gradual development in the ideological content away from the ancient Egyptian models and more toward the Hellenistic models. This is simply because the old culture of Egypt was retreating increasingly into the background. Knowledge of hieroglyphics and the cultic forms of the gods and goddesses of the Nile slowly gave way to more foreign features. Among these foreign influences was the growing presence of Christian material. The vast majority of the magical papyri we have date from this period 200 to 400 CE. Their contents are certainly older, but the actual dates of most of the papyri themselves fall within this time frame. Technical Hermetica were being written perhaps as early as the middle of the 2nd century BCE. These were for the most part scientific treatises on hidden sympathies between natural phenomena, and here too was the beginnings of alchemy, later to become a dominant aspect of Hermeticism. The ideological content of the papyri form a relatively stable mixture of elements. The three main components of this mixture, 10a History of Hermetic Magic, are the Egyptian, Greek, and Hebraic mythological and magical traditions. The Hermetic magician philosophers used these elements in ways independent of any of the official traditions themselves. They were neither simply Egyptian or Greek pagans, nor were they Jews, and they were certainly not Christians. They had formed their own eclectic philosophical and operative religion and spiritual technology. The magical traditions developed in three different strata of the written record. There were Demotic Egyptian magical papyri, whose contents are mostly Egyptian and, we must suppose, most representative of the ancient Egyptian magical technologies, Coptic magical papyri, beginning around 100 CE, which come to embody a Hermeto-Christian synthesis, and the Greek magical papyri, which are essentially pagan and cosmopolitan. Medieval. With the eventual development of dogmatic development institutionalized Christianity, the Hermetic tradition was increasingly suppressed in the geographical regions controlled by the Church. Hermetic magic and philosophy, like that of all other non-Christian systems, was ruthlessly persecuted. Curiously, however, the Hermetic tradition, at least the written form of it, was given a high level of respect and admiration by some of the early church leaders and writers. For example, Didymus the Blind, ca. 313 to 398, quotes from known Hermetic texts in his Christian treatise titled On the Trinity. Before him, Lactantius had praised Hermes Trismegistus as a prophet of Christ, as did Cyril of Alexandria, died 444. These men and many others were so impressed by Hermetic teachings that they incorporated many of them in their Christian doctrines, and simply saw in them the true reachings of Christ. Hermes came to be called by some a Christian before Christ. Following the rise of Islam in the East, which conquered Egypt in 638 CE, the Hermetic body of literature, as well as the ideas contained in it, was preserved better in the Islamic world. This is because Islam was more tolerant when it came to divergent ideas than were the Christians of the period. As long as the Muslim met his religious origins. 11. Obligations to Allah. What he did in other fields was often more or less his own affair. Islamic assimilation of magical technology in both the fields of operative magic as well as in the areas of alchemy and astrology, which were also part of the early Hermetic tradition, ensured its survival. The Church could not, however, prevent Hermetic ideas from penetrating into European culture even at the height of its power in the Middle Ages. For example, texts from the 1100s and 1200s which celebrate the mysteries of courtly love and the Grail legends often contain Gnostic and Hermetic ideas. The epic Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach is the crown of this creative achievement. At the same time, many Hermetic and Gnostic ideas were absorbed into the esoteric tradition, or Kabbalah, of the medieval Jews throughout the world. These were mixed with their own theology and unique mystical insights and preserved in their remarkable books and schools of wisdom. Because they stood outside the stream of Christian dogma, these traditions were able to survive intact. The modern phase. Renaissance in the modern world really began Enlightenment philosophy in northern Ireland during the 15th century. Although modernism is characterized by the intellectual rejection of medieval Christian teachings based on faith in favor of objective knowledge, nevertheless it bore the legacy of the long shadow of the Church in many ways. The new Hermeticists in the West would be men who still had a great deal of sentimental attachment to some ideas inherent in Church teachings. They were therefore much more likely to see Christian things in the Hermetic tradition that were never actually there. Or Wolfram von Eschenbach, Parzival, New York, Viking Penguin, 1980. 12a His of T. Hermoetircy Magic. That were actually borrowed from Hermetic teachings by early Christians. From a Hermetic perspective, indeed, the teachings of the thrice greatest were the root of all religions and all philosophies. Because Hermeticism is suited to account for all types of philosophies, it can be considered the root of all philosophies. In fact, as we have seen, this discovery of Christian ideas in Hermetica was an old phenomenon at the time of the Renaissance. It had come so far by the 1400s in Italy that Hermes Trismegistus was honored as a quasi-saint in the artwork of the cathedral at Siena, Italy, built around 1488. There we find a pavement mosaic with the inscription Hermis Mercurius Trismegistus Contemporaneus Mois, Hermes Mercury the thrice greatest, contemporary of Moses. Most of what the West had learned of the Hermetic tradition in the Middle Ages was fragmentary. But in 1460, the ruler of Florentine, Cosimo de' Medici, acquired an original Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum and immediately commissioned the Florentine scholar and magician Marsilio Ficino to translate the entire text into Latin. This work was completed in 1463. In those days it was widely believed that the corpus contained the most ancient religious teaching available to humankind. By the way, most Renaissance philosophers and magicians believed they were being perfectly orthodox in their Christianity and their explorations of the Hermetic tradition, because they thought it represented the original theology, which found its culmination in Christ. Throughout the Renaissance, more and more original Greek and Latin magical texts came to the attention of magicians and philosophers, both spiritual and natural. Also, Arabic texts based on the Hermetic tradition, especially in the field of alchemy, found their way into the increasingly free intellectual world of Western Europe. The role of magic, especially Hermetic magic, in the development of modern natural sciences remains generally unacknowledged. It is true, however, that many of the models of understanding, as well as fundamental theories used by, for example, Paracelsus, father of modern medicine, during the Renaissance, or Isaac Newton in the Enlightenment, had their origins in magical Hermetic philosophy. Chief among these ideas is the assumption that there is a direct origins 13. Correspondence between the larger world and the smaller one, between what would be called the macrocosm and the microcosm. Romantic beginning in the 19th century, the Hemmitt Occult revival tradition began to reassert itself as a truly spiritual methodology. This new beginning occurred during the Romantic period of European intellectual history. Interest in magic, and even the code word, Hermetic, found a new level of enthusiasm. The magical papyri were discovered in Egypt in the early part of the 19th century and transported to various Western European libraries and museums. For these seminal magical texts made little or no impact on the practice of magic in the occult revival. The tradition they represented had undergone such a transformation through the centuries that the original essence could now hardly be recognized as being truly Hermetic. So much elegant Victorian refinement and civilization had turned the vital and vibrant tradition of the papyri into the long-winded mutterings of a few old gentlemen. It is ironic that the popularity of the idea of Hermeticism and the discovery of the actual papyri should come so close together historically. It would be another 100 years before the papyri were analyzed and published as a corpus. For many years the idea of Hermeticism was popular among practicing magicians, but the actual Hermetic tradition of magic remained secluded in the truly arcane world of academia. An early and somewhat inaccurate translation of one of the papyri by Charles Wycliffe Goodwin provided the Bournless ritual, used by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and subsequently by Aleister Crowley in his translation of the Goetia, or Lesser Key of Solomon. The postmodern phase. Does anyone doubt that since the end of World War II we have been living on the brink of two new era in the history of the development of human ideas? At present we are in a rather confusing twilight zone. 14a History of Hermetic Magic. For most people, but in the years to come, more and more people will begin to abandon the feudal universalistic pipe dreams of the modernists, as they abandoned the Catholic nightmares of the medievalists before them. For want of a better term, this new era is at present being called the postmodern period. Postmodernism is characterized by a freedom from the pervasive modern myth of progress, the idea that as time goes on, by applying ever-increasing rationality and scientific methodology, the problems of the world will be universally evaporated in the light of pure reason. The postmodernist realizes, as did the ancients, that such progress is only possible for individuals. Furthermore, the postmodernist is free of the constraints of modern progressivism. To the modern, if it's not new, if it's not the latest thing, then it is retrograde or reactionary, and hence unacceptable. Postmodernists are free to synthesize elements from all phases of human history, in any shape or form that suits their purposes. Therefore, the contents of texts such as the magical papyri gain a new relevance and potential for individual empowerment. The papyri in history. It is in the papyri, written down in the first few centuries of our era, that we have the most direct evidence of the nature and quality of the earliest form of the Hermetic school of magic. Without the survival of these physical objects, we would be able to know virtually nothing of the true tradition. Until recently, the knowledge contained in these papyri has been obscured by ignorance and misunderstanding. Papyrus is an early form of highly durable paper, a word derived from the Greek mamupag, an Egyptian rush with triangular leaves. It was used in early Egyptian times, from about the 5th dynasty, or 2500 BCE, where relatively few survive from that very ancient period. Most of the original magical papyri adapted for this collection were written between the 1st and 6th centuries CE, Thardas B. Origins 15. Between the time of the historical Jesus and the year 500 CE. The vast majority of the magical papyri are written with ink in the Greek language and using Greek letters. A few magical papyri were also written in Demotic Egyptian. Time and intellectual tyrants have not been kind to the magical literary tradition. Early Christian church leaders were very anxious to destroy the magical texts, usually by burning, and sometimes those who possessed such books were also burned along with them. In the Acts of the Apostles 19:19, we read that in Ephesus, an ancient city famous for magic located in what is now western Turkey, many magicians' books were burned as a part of the price of conversion to Christianity. The early Muslims were no kinder to the old pagan learning. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria in 641 is only the most famous example of the attempted programmatic destruction of the intellectual heritage of pagan antiquity by the orthodox religious forces of the day. An extremely small fraction of these texts did survive. A number of them were collected by an unknown magician and scholar in the ancient city of Thebes, present-day Luxor. This unknown collector must have lived sometime before the year 500 CE. He collected magical papyri in both the Greek and the Egyptian tongue, and was certainly a learned Egyptian, probably also of a philosophical type. Without doubt he was one of the last of the learned pagans, the keeper of a wisdom which was finally utterly extinguished by the coming of the Islamic conquest in the middle of the 7th century. It was Egyptian tradition to bury sacred magical texts with the bodies of their owners. It was probably in such a tomb, the tomb of the unknown collector, that the papyri were discovered, or robbed, around 1,300 years after the death and burial of the collector. In the wake of Napoleon's conquest of parts of Egypt, in 1798, Europeans began looting, destroying, and in some cases saving, large amounts of the surviving Egyptian antiquities. One of these men was an ethnic Armenian calling himself Jean d'Anastasi, 17802-1857. He bought the bulk of the known magical papyri in a single purchase in Thebes and had the entire lot shipped to Europe where the OCR processing of this PDF file was interrupted due to pressing the stop button or power disconnection. To continue OCR, open the same PDF file again, then press the continue button when prompted. There are no more articles to read.
Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Let us know what you think below about the book.